This video will show you how to run a Python program on the Linux operating system or the Mac operating system. I don't have access to a Mac, but everything that I show you here should also work for a Mac, because in many years when I used to have a Mac, I would open up what we call terminal windows like this and run code exactly the way I'm showing you here. So the good news is, if you have a Mac or Linux, you probably already have Python installed. And one way to check that would be to type this. Just type which, that's W-H-I-C-H, Python. That's probably the Python 2.7 version. I can find out by just running this. Python, this takes me to shell, and you see it's Python 2.7.17. Right? To get out of this, I type exit and then put parentheses, because it's a function call, and exit out. Now if I type which Python 3, because I want to use Python 3.x for my videos, we'll check for this. Excuse me, it should be which Python 3. You can see there it is in user bin, and running it will give me this, and you can see I'm using Python 3.6.10 as the version, because that's the one that's installed. What if you don't have Python installed, or you don't see this? Well, first of all, let's check and see what your path is. If we type echo space $ capital PATH, that shows my path. So it looks first. These are the places where it's going to look for the program that I typed here. So it's looking first in home Brazil bin, and there's colon, then user local bin, then user bin, which is where it found it. And then in theory, it could look in then /bin, and also could look here on my machine. Of course, you won't have the Brazil directories, those are mine. But your path probably includes user local bin and user bin, and even a bin within your own home directory. If you have these in your path, but you still don't find it, then there's a good chance it's not installed. So you may have to actually install it. So what do we want to do on that? Well, I'm making this video in August of 2020. So in August of 2020, we're up to the Python 3.8.5 version. So you'll probably want to click on either Linux or Unix or Mac OS to get the one that you want for you. But while we're here, let's look at these releases. So here's some versions of Python showing when they were first released and when the end of support for that version occurred. You can see 2.7 first came out 10 years ago in 2010, and support for it ended in January of this year. So it stuck around for a long time. You can install 2.7 if you need to, maybe if you have a really old computer, maybe one of these other versions doesn't work. But if possible, I'd encourage you to go with the latest version. Everything I'm going to show you should work in some version of Python shown here. There's some minor differences between the 2.x series and the 3.x series, but I would have to think that everything I teach will work in some form on all this stuff. The primary differences between these two in terms of what I'm going to teach are this. If I have, we'll open up the windows side by side. This would be Python 2.7 and Python 3. So here if I type, notice I say print space, and I have quotes, this is a message, and we'll leave it at that. That prints. If I try the same thing here, I get an error message. Because in Python 3.x and above, what we really want you to do is make it like a true function call. And if you're new to programming, you might not know what these words mean, but it needs to be inside parentheses is what's saying. Whereas this is considered what we call a statement. Note the space there between print and the message in here. And now when I do that, I get this. The other difference between the two that will show up in most of my code, there's lots of differences between the two, but in terms of my code, it's either how you print or what we call integer division. If I have over here a is equal to 10, well, let's make this 9. B is equal to 4. C is equal to A divided by B. Let's print C. I get 2. But over here, if I type A is equal to 9, B is equal to 4, C is equal to A divided by B, print, in parentheses C, I get 2.25. So this is what your calculator or your own math, if you're doing on paper, would tell you. 9 divided by 4 is 2 1/4. So what's happening here? Well, this A and this B are considered integers, or they're of type int. In fact, I can type this right here. Type A here, it's class int. Type A here is type int. In 2.7 and earlier versions, when you divide in something of this type, int, by an int, you get another int, which means it has to round off. And Python rounds down, so the 2 1/4 becomes 2. It gets rid of the 0.25. In Python 3.x and above, integer division like this, or dividing an integer by an integer, gives you a floating point result, which is what this is. Because if I type C, I get float. Over here I type C, I still get an int. So if I really want to get some result over here, I would say C is equal to A//B. Now print C, and I get the 2. So this is how you'd match the same functionality. But even though those two things seem trivial, those are the primary differences in terms of what I use in Python between the two different versions. But since there's no longer support for 2.7, you might as well get used to using 3.x, especially if you're learning Python for the first time. To get out of either of these, type exit, parentheses, and then exit, parentheses. All right? So if you need to, download the appropriate version of Python and install it. So what do you do once you want to run code? Well, what we were just looking at is what's called a shell. And a shell is fine to a point. Lots of tutorials will show you this is how you program. So you'd open up Python like this, and I type my stuff like I just showed you. A is equal to 34, and print A is equal to %D. And we get that. But this gets old real fast. It has a scalability problem. It's fine for a couple of lines of code, but it's not very easy to use if you have many lines of code. And even by the time I got to 10 lines of code, I would already find this painful. Because how do I go back and change this program? Am I going to cut and paste it? Probably not. So instead, I want to use some type of text editor to write my code and then just run from the command line. That's how I choose to do it. Now, there are full-blown what we call IDEs, integrated development environments, in which you can write your code and run your code within the environment. If that's what you prefer, that's certainly fine. I prefer to work from my command line or within a terminal window using something called Vim. That's a text editor. And so I could do something like this. We'll say ex.py. And now I could say, you know, this is a single line comment. This is a multi-line comment. Just as examples, now I can say something like A is equal to 23, B is equal to 56, C is equal to A plus B, and then say if C is greater than 40, colon, and I have to indent here. This requires indentation for this part. Print C, or print C is greater than 40. And if you're new to programming, all this stuff I'm doing here won't make a lot of sense, but that's the reason why you're watching the video series, is learn how to do these things. And then I have an else if I want. Less than or equal. So this basically says if this relationship here is true, then print this line, C is greater than 40. Otherwise, that's what the else here means, print C is less than or equal to 40. So how would I run it? Well, then I can come over here. If we look in this directory, you see there's the file I created. They need to be in the same place. I'm going to type Python 3 and the name of my program, and it prints C is greater than 40. But because I'm doing it in this window here, or this editor, it's easy to come in here and change this. What if I would change this into make this 2 and 5. Rerun it, and now I get C is less than or equal to 40. So that was easy to do. Whereas if I'd been in the shell here, that would not have been easy to modify my program. So this is the way to go. Now you don't have to use Vim. That's my preference. And I have a video that will briefly try to get you up to speed as well as show some basic Linux navigation because I'm using a Linux operating system. But you don't need to know any of that to program. But you do need to have some way of editing files. Now if you install Windows, it comes with an editor called IDLE. Spelled, I-D-L-E. On my Linux computer, that was not installed by default. So I had to actually install that. And so now you can see it actually exists. So I can type which, IDLE 3, because we'll get that one. There it is, and I could then run it if I wanted to edit. If you want to do something similar to what I'm doing, where you just use an editor and run from the command line, then do a search for programming editors. So free programming editor Linux, here's a list. See, there's Vim, which I use. If you're using a Mac, get that right there. Windows. Get that right there. If you want to pay for one, you certainly can do that, or if you already have a paid programming editor. Now, ultimately what you need is something that saves in what we call plain text. So I'm going to type here file, ex. You see it just says ASCII text. And this won't mean much now, but in a later video I'll discuss that more. But if you're familiar with the Windows operating system, then the Notepad editor creates plain text files. So they would show up like this as well, ASCII text. On Linux or Macs, I don't know what the default plain text editors are, but Vim, which is already installed on my operating system, creates plain text. You could go with something like Notepad for doing the editing or whatever the equivalent is on Linux or Mac OS. But the problem is with those other editors, if all they do is create plain text, then they're too dumb to help you. You want something that helps you. So notice when I look at this file again, notice the different colors. This is called syntax highlighting. So if I had saved this like this, let's call this erase.txt. And now let's quit out of this. Let me do vim erase.txt. Notice it's all the same color. Does it work fine? Sure. This can work, but the colors are there to help me as the programmer by highlighting things and making it obvious to see certain things. So for example, if I come to this, you can see how the comment style is a certain color, or this. Or if and else are what we call keywords. They mean something in the computer and print. So if I had accidentally typed this, notice how the colors just changed, showing me that I made a mistake. And that alerts me that I need to fix something. And there's the fix. So have something that helps you. Now, real programming editors can do much more than this. They can do auto completion. So maybe you start to type something and it realizes what you're typing and it tries to help you out, like what your messaging apps do on your phones, things like that. Ultimately, some type of programming editor, or like this says here, code editor, whatever, is what you need to get. But you need to decide what you want to use. Now, I do use Vim, but Vim has a very large learning curve. And so that may be more than you want to take on if you're learning to program in the first place. But if you're up to it, enjoy Vim, because it has lots of benefits if you're editing text files. So that should get you started on how to at least create and run a program using Linux or Mac OS.